welcome to Points of View, a discussion of issues regarding persons with disabilities, moderated by Doug Usiak.
Today's panelists are Frank Cammerata, Executive Director of the Erie County Office for the Disabled; Todd Vaarwerk, Director of Advocacy and Public Policy of Western New York Independent Living; and Dave Whalen, Project Director for First Responder Disability Awareness Training at Niagara University.
For years, people have been talking about emergency preparedness, especially in our country in the wake of hurricanes and other disasters that we've had to face and things that weren't expected to happen. And one of the equations that some of us in the disability community have been thinking about is, what about people with disabilities? What's out there for them? What happens when there's a lack of accessibility? And what is it that our communities can do in light of emergency preparedness? So to begin the discussion, what I'd like to throw out there is, what do we actually mean when we talk about emergency preparedness?
One of the things we basically focus on with preparedness is, am I aware of what my personal needs are relative to responding to whatever the disaster may be? Within each emergency, as defined, a tornado, a hurricane, a flood, a plane crash, a winter storm, so on and so forth, we actually can break those down per storm or per emergency. But it's emergency, it's a disaster, and it's a catastrophe. So there is a hierarchy to what we're talking about, and then everything that would lead into an individual's needs. People with disabilities will have differing needs that would need to be either addressed relative to being prepared, and then when we talk later about the response and then the recovery side of it.
Yeah, but when you talk about disaster and catastrophe, I mean, how do we define the difference in all of that? What makes a difference between a catastrophe and a disaster?
An emergency could be something as simple as, your street gets flooded. Cops are called. Maybe your local Department of Public Works is going to block your street off till they drain it. Okay? It's an emergency. When we get up to disaster level, we're talking about wider and wider areas of effect. So a disaster might be something that's going to affect an entire town or a major portion of a town. You're getting into catastrophe, or you're getting into what I would refer to as capital E emergency, when you're talking about something that affects multiple jurisdictions. And when we're talking about disaster preparedness, we try to lump all of those areas together, and that's a little bit why it's so confusing.
Now, for an individual who's listening to the show, and we just talked about emergencies, catastrophes, and disasters, and they alluded earlier, Dave, when you mentioned response, I mean, there's different responses for different levels. I mean, how does the average Joe out there know what we're talking about?
Well, look at it this way. A 911 call is considered an emergency call. As defined, only 10% of 911 calls are true emergencies. So that in and of itself is an emergency. Whatever my need for that call is, I've fallen and I really hurt myself bad, I'm going to survive. I'm going to be fine in the long run, but it's an emergency. Or there's 3 or 4 houses that are now on fire on the street. So you kind of can see, as Todd talked about, how the magnitude of that would get bigger and call for a differing response. Your first responders / your emergency responders, which are 2 differently defined entities. Your first responder is law enforcement, your fire department, your EMS. Your emergency responder gets into your emergency management offices and individuals that are charged solely with the emergency management, which gets into the larger scale picture that Todd was talking about.
So Frank, when we're talking about these responders and stuff, when we're talking about cities and villages and states and counties, I mean, isn't there a level of bureaucracy there that gets a little confusing?
There can be, but actually, it's believe it or not, it's kind of neatly packaged. And having worked with the county's emergency manager, I know that there is a system in place that, like Todd was saying before, basically you're starting with that small little 911 call, and you're because your street is flooded, which moves to actually the creek overflows and takes over an entire block to, that entire block then takes over a multitude of blocks. So, basically, when an emergency happens and it reaches to the level of that multiple blocks being flooded or being taken over by a storm or by water, that's when the higher authorities are contacted.
And Doug, if I could, to add on to that, so as Frank alluded to, you might have a block now, which we had locally not too long ago in West Seneca, New York, where we had a block that was flooded. That town, that municipal manager, emergency manager, takes responsibility for that. He or she is already have contacted the county. The county is probably still going to come and assist on that. They're not necessarily waiting, well, do you want us to come? So they're going to be there. What people tend to get confused with then is when it gets to the state and the federal level. Oftentimes you'll hear people say during a major disaster, well, FEMA should have done this, or FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Authority, they don't come to play until they're asked to come to play by the state. The state doesn't get involved until the county asks them to come to play, to get involved with that situation or that disaster.
Now, some of these emergencies or disasters or yep, it's easy for you guys to say it.
Catastrophe.
Thank you very much. But some of these situations that you're facing, individuals need to literally leave their home and go somewheres and be somewheres. And most of us call that a shelter. But for people with disabilities, that creates a whole new level of problems, doesn't it, Todd?
Absolutely it does. Because you've got to ask yourself, in an emergency and they're evacuating people to shelters, where is the accessible transportation at? Where do they go? It's the same argument that we make about, when in Buffalo we issue driving bans to people. Well, if there's a driving ban and I need to be able to get out because my street's completely blocked off, who's going to come, who's going to come and help me get out? Because there's a driving ban. It's also a thing about the, which way do we want it? Because sheltering moves in two directions, either making a shelter accessible or what the state lovingly refers to as sheltering in place.
Now, is sheltering something that a community, a county, a state, or whoever, is that something that has to be done?
If you're talking about a particular disaster where people are going to be out of their homes, they need to be evacuated, yeah. And the American Red Cross is in charge for the most part of those shelters. So it now steps a little bit off of the municipal responsibility, be it town, county, or state, and the Red Cross steps in. But I do want to take a step back on your last question, Doug, because a lot of times where we tend to make the mistake first and foremost is we say, what is the municipality going to do for me during an emergency? The true first responder is not someone who is employed or is a volunteer firefighter within that municipality. The true first responder is a neighbor, is a family member. It's someone that we encourage people to set up a network of supports that will assist them during that particular emergency.
Okay, we're going to have to take a break here, and when we get back, we'll further explore where Dave's coming from as far as the neighbor being involved in this situation. So right after this message, we'll be back.
Today, people with disabilities are participating fully in the social and economic life of New York State. In large measure, this is true because of the work of an independent living center in your community. The New York State Independent Living Council is dedicated to promoting the independent living philosophy and to facilitating access to independent living services. For more information on the Council or about your nearest independent living center, call toll-free 1-888-469-7452.
Are you looking for new ideas to help you sell? Need a presentation that must compel? Have a message you wish to dispel? Or an important story you need to tell? Are you exploring new ways to communicate, to motivate, to educate, or demonstrate? Or are you searching for creative concepts to help you entertain, promote your brand name, to effectively train, or launch a new web domain name? Then focus on Creative Concept Studios and see the possibilities.
Welcome back. We were talking about emergency preparedness, and we had gotten into the discussion here of the first responders. And Dave, you were making a point that the first responder isn't necessarily always the policeman or the fireman.
Yeah, when we get into that true disaster, Some of the misconceptions, especially with people with excess and functional needs or disabilities, is the thought that they're going to come and get me. You know, they being the emergency management, the volunteer fire department, the fire department, someone in that first responder capacity. And we know that's not the case. We actually tell people to plan that nobody's coming to get you. Your network of supports is going to be the people that you've identified. You've set this up prior to an emergency, that my neighbor or neighbors, there's a whole process out there called the CERT, or the Community Emergency Response Team. And we make a big push on that. These are people that are trained, that are trained through and work with, in a volunteer basis with the municipality emergency management team. So there's a whole base here that we want people to establish so that they're not reliant on someone coming.
So there's
to
a
get
level
them.
of responsibility on the individual to make sure that something happens in their own life.
Absolutely. Consumer choice
But-
doesn't stop because someone's declared an emergency.
But does that not also create a little bit of a clash? Because for most people, if they don't have a disability or an issue, they can just walk to wherever they got to go or wherever they got to be, jump in their car. So, you know, when it comes to the community responsibility to the various people out there with disabilities, people who are blind or deaf with mobility impairment, you know, what's the level of responsibility for the municipality to communicate with the various populations out there?
The responsibility is it's a high responsibility, and it can be quite daunting as well. As you know, people with varying levels of ability, you know, the blind community, the deaf community, they all have their own certain needs or their own certain ways of communication and their own certain needs. So it makes it.
I think Frank makes a broader point. I think the broader community has a responsibility when we talk about people with disabilities to make sure that we have the tools necessary to know what and where the resources are. So it's key that community emergency responders, when we're getting up on that emergency level and we're talking about broadcasting something on the radio or broadcasting something on TV, that stuff is accessible to everyone so that it can be heard. Okay? It's important that the community responders consider that people with disabilities live in the community. And the only example I have to point to, and I hate to bring it up, is 9/11, where they trapped thousands of people with disabilities in Lower Manhattan because they made the decision to close Lower Manhattan without thinking about the people that couldn't get out. So if we start by recognizing that people with disabilities live in the community and we have to figure out a way to deal with it, and then we say we have to communicate with those people in an accessible way so that they know where the resources are.
Yeah, but there were compound issues in that particular situation, as well as when the hurricane came in. I suspect the same with Katrina years ago. But are you not facing a compounded problem that if the communities aren't providing adequate transportation for everybody right now, or communication, that how are you going to get people who are mobility impaired to where they got to go?
Well, it's a joint plan. One, it's about you knowing where your resources are and starting to say, okay, they're evacuating my neighborhood, how am I going to handle that? And picking up the phone and calling somebody or going to those circle of supports and saying, you're going to the shelter, can I come along?
Yeah, but Frank, isn't it the responsibility of the government to be able to address and anticipate those needs and not totally always expect that the person in the community is going to come and say, yo, before an emergency, make sure you got a lift on that van? I mean, if the government's already thinking about the fact that, you know, we've got to have emergency preparedness in this area, that area, or whatever area, should not the levels of government be prepared to accommodate the differences within the people that live within their geographic area?
It's an excellent question, Doug. And, you know, I can tell you that Erie County government has planned for and exercises for many different disaster type scenarios. But one never knows, or one can never fathom something like 9/11 happening. And when something like that does happen, it obviously will throw a curveball to the municipality and to the citizens together.
And if I could, to expand on that, what the Administrator Fugate of FEMA has said is, and we fully support this, is recognize the whole community, and the whole community being people with disabilities actively involved in the planning process. So Frank is being the ADA coordinator of Erie County, for an example. He also chairs the Disability Advisory Board of the county. One of our major tasks on that is to address emergency management. I chair my town's committee on disabilities. I've met more with the emergency manager than we as a committee have met more with the emergency manager than any other faction of municipal response. We also go back to the community resources. We expect independent living centers to be reaching out to their individuals with disabilities. I can call my IL and get information. I can call my deaf adult services and get information. They're briefed on it. So there's an expectation that really it's a two-way street, that these individuals who may have no idea how this process works. We can't assume that people with disabilities know what how to reach out, or that there's people like Frank and ADA coordinators and advisory groups and boards. But we need our community resources and networks to also be educating. So this is a process in many different factions.
What about the level of the various responders who are out there? I mean, is there something that's being done in order for this to be on the minds of the responders? I mean, in case of emergency, you're thinking, obviously, if it's a fire or earthquake or whatever, you're thinking about a whole variety of other issues regarding, what person's in a wheelchair.
I think, Doug, I'm sorry, Frank.
Go ahead, Dave.
Well, I think our biggest task and our biggest issue right now is ensuring that emergency management across all spectrums of municipal levels recognize the need to include people with disabilities. And quite frankly, in some of my work and the work of the New York State Independent Living Council and the Emergency Preparedness Subcommittee, we're doing that outreach to educate them. I had the opportunity this year to do a presentation at the New York State Emergency Management Association relative to this exact topic we're talking about here.
And on that note, we're going to take a break right here. And when we get back, we're going to find out what's being done. What does the future look like as far as being emergency prepared? See you in a minute.
Today, people with disabilities are participating fully in the social and economic life of New York State. In large measure, this is true because of the work of an independent living center in your community. The New York State Independent Living Council is dedicated to promoting the independent living philosophy and to facilitating access to independent living services. For more information on the Council or about your nearest independent living center, call toll-free 1-888-469-7452.
Are you looking for new ideas to help you sell? Need a presentation that must compel? Have a message you wish to dispel? Or an important story you need to tell? Are you exploring new ways to communicate, to motivate, to educate, or demonstrate? Or are you searching for creative concepts to help you entertain, promote your brand name, to effectively train, or launch a new web domain name? Then focus on Creative Concept Studios and see the possibilities.
Welcome back. We're talking about emergency preparedness for people with disabilities in the community, and I'd like to get into talking about, what's the responsibility of people with disabilities and what can they do in order to protect themselves within the community when and if something happens, and what is the community doing?
I can tell you, Doug, that my office, the Office for the Disabled, has an advisory board, and the advisory board has actually taken a very active role within the emergency management purview. And as of recently, we've actually had a couple members on that board participate in exercises in disaster exercises. And there are future exercises planned which the members of the board will be participating in as well.
And I think that's the first consumer step. That's be aware of what your community's doing, and if you're able to participate in that kind of stuff, absolutely do so, because that's the way that you're going to learn what the sense of what the default response is. Who that person is going to be that's going to direct that.
I want to interject here. I thought it just crossed my mind, Dave, and I'm just thinking, would it be a good thing for people to look within their communities and, we all dread that big one, the big earthquake or the airplane falling out of the sky or something like that. But within every community where people live, there are emergencies that occur all the time. In Western New York, certainly, snow is a big issue. Mm-hmm. Would it not be a good idea that individuals try to identify what are those reoccurring emergencies, if they're only a day or a week or whatever, to think about what they need and communicate that to somebody?
Definitely. I mean, go back to what I said earlier about, within each disaster we have a definition relative to need, not just what it is, but what is that going to call for? When we talk about flooding, we don't know what's going to be flooded. The shelters that we've identified might be in the flood area, or the tornado might rip through those shelters that we identified, what have you. But to your point, knowing your particular region well, to our area, we would certainly be privy to, as the rest of New York State would be privy to winter storms. What does that call for me and what are my needs? So, for instance, winter storm would be what? Blankets, something along those lines that I would need. And then we get into individual identification. So my medication regime. We tell people to prepare for 3 days of meds, and some people say I would like to prepare more. That's fine. That's good. If I use a power wheelchair, what do I need? Well, I would need some form of battery charger. Do I have one small enough to bring with me? But then, as Todd talked about earlier, in the shelter, we would expect that they would have that ready. So there's a whole dynamic here that Frank referenced, and one of the things that we're looking to do in an upcoming meeting, and this is what we encourage many people to do, is have all the players at that meeting and in discussion with that. So, for instance, I just mentioned durable medical equipment needs. At our June meeting, we're going to bring in a local durable medical equipment vendor who's going to be a part of that to advise and give us information.
Now, how does that relate to the responsibility of the municipalities and the various levels of government, Frank?
How does that relate?
Yeah, this need that I've identified for myself, and who do I go to, and what can I actually expect government to do for me?
Well, I think again it goes to I don't think you should expect government to do for you. I think you have to be prepared for something yourself. You have to be prepared, like Dave said, having a spare battery or having that spare medication, but so you have that sense of independence or being able to be ready for that disaster or that emergency, and then you have the.
But Frank, I think that you should be able to expect the county to effectively communicate the resources in the disaster.
Oh, I agree with you, Todd.
I think that that is absolutely from the community's perspective where it starts. If they've gone through all this effort to have Red Cross set up shelters and they know where they are, and this stuff should be communicated in such a way that I shouldn't need to try and figure out why my house doesn't have power so that I can go to Twitter and read a tweet from the emergency manager as to where my accessible shelter is. Mm-hmm. We should be dealing with that right away. The closed captioning should be announcing that information. The announcers should be describing that information for visually impaired people. And there should, when you're doing a public press conference about the dynamic of an emergency, be an interpreter on screen with someone and talking about those issues. Communication is key. You can ask me as a consumer to be prepared, but if I don't know what community resources are out there, what the hell am I preparing for?
So
excellent point.
What's actually being done now? I mean, what are we seeing happening in order to assist persons with disabilities in the community in case of an emergency?
What's being now is, again, my advisory group is working directly with emergency management. I am working directly with emergency management. So we are preparing for, we're participating in exercises. We're making emergency management aware of the needs of persons with disabilities.
And if I could take that further, the Americans with Disabilities Act, through the Department of Justice, has provided ample resources to identify what those needs are. So we highly encourage municipalities and emergency managers to access the toolkit, is what they call it, which allows you to actually have a checklist of what I need to have. So there is resources, extensive resources actually, that allow you to have all the answers to what your needs are. How do I respond to service animals? What is, as Todd talked about, general effective communication is the term under the Americans with Disabilities Act. What does that mean? And we have all those tools and information and resources for folks. It goes back to them making sure that they have this as part of their agenda relative to preparing for that emergency.
Look, making sure, I'm sorry, Todd, but making sure that persons with disabilities are on that agenda. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a small go bag of equipment, actually. I have one at home and I have one in my office. It's not a lot, but it's a way for me to get information. It's a battery-powered radio for me to be able to get information. There's a flashlight. There's a couple of pouches of water. I mean, you know, if I'm stuck for a few hours to a couple days, I'm good to go, and I can at least find myself a safe place until I can get myself evacuated to a shelter. But believe it or not, that's how I think about it. It's getting myself evacuated to a shelter, not waiting for a rescue worker to come and get me.
And on that note, I'd like to say thank you. And when it comes to emergency preparedness, it starts with you. And then communicate who you are and where you are to those who need to know that. Thank you, and we'll see you at the next show.
Points of View is presented by the New York State Independent Living Council, Incorporated, in cooperation with the Catskill Center for Independence, Finger Lakes Independence Center, Independent Living of Niagara County, and Western New York Independent Living. For the location of the Independent Living Center in your area, call toll-free 1-888-469-7452.